Hello, hello. Oh, welcome to podcast 31. I'd hoped to have this podcast ready, a week early so that the podcast could start coming out on freaking Tuesday like they're supposed to. But here I am, recording podcast 31 the day before podcast 32 was supposed to come out. Oh, can I write, record, edit, and post 2 podcasts in the space of 2 days so I can start on next week's podcast and start being on schedule for a change? Well, let's find out. Today in the fanfiction segment, we're reading the second half of my second fanfic, Monsters vs. Vampires. I found the first half of Monsters vs. Vampires to be a lot more enjoyable and less embarrassing than I thought it would be, so let's see how the second half goes. Chapter 12, It's My Party, narrated by Bella. Alice is preparing the Cullen household for the first official annual monster convention. The Lapush werewolf guys and the Alaskan vampire cousins are also attending. When the Modesto monsters show up, Link is given some birthday presents, including the novelty Wii Sports Resort, and from Esme and Carlisle, a vacation home in New Zealand. Edward and Angel play cards, the inevitable joke about the mind readers from 2 different series. It's just a bunch of skits. Let's move on. Chapter 13, Need to Know, is a short chapter from the perspective of Charlie, Bella's dad. Basically, I wanted an excuse for him to narrate, and for a couple of good jokes, so just a tiny irrelevant chapter. Charlie is hanging out with Billy, and they talk about the monster convention. There's a nice reveal there. I get a lot of mileage out of how Charlie accepts that he's not allowed to know much of what's going on, and so simply accepts everything that happens. When he finds out about the monster convention, his response is, well, that explains the giant dancing bug, the Insectosaurus having been visible the whole time. And then Charlie casually mentions about Bella, you ever notice that she has no heartbeat? So, a pretty solid chapter. There's a reason Charlie is among the more popular Twilight characters, having motivations and reactions that make a lick of sense, Chapter 4, The Game, is narrated by Alice. I think I had originally wanted to call this chapter The Game, but then possibly realized that the chapter in Twilight about the vampire baseball game was in fact called The Game, so I switched it to Da Game. Yeah, the Cullens decide to play a full 18-player game of vampire baseball with Link and Alice as captains. Link's first pick for his team is Jacob in order to cloud Alice's future vision, while Alice's first pick is Insectosaurus, who would certainly be an advantage on any sports team. There's some comedy as they pick the team. Let me take a look at the lineups they end up getting. Link gets Susan, so another big advantage there. Alice gets 2 werewolves, who definitely wouldn't be quite as good in the game as vampires, and Link picks 2 members of the flock, who'd definitely be at a huge disadvantage. Yeah, again, I really nerfed just how much more powerful Twilight vampires are than everything else. Carlisle gets a phone call from the Volturi. Aro and Marcus have learned of the monster convention and thought it best not to tell Caius, which, yeah, clearly Caius's open hostility made me miss the fact that all 3 of the Volturi want all the Cullens captured or dead. I was writing Twilight fanfiction. Clearly I was a big dummy. Chapter 15, Fly Home, narrated by Fang. The bird kids are flying somewhere after the monster convention. Nudge mentions how she's now dating an ex-werewolf by the name of Aaron. Fang and Max have a private word where Max admits she's incredibly on edge now that the flock have gone almost 2 weeks without being attacked. Sure that it means the peace will be disrupted any second now, and Fang tries to calm her down. A conversation about their love life, eventually driving Max to scream and run away. Well, fly away. Chapter 16, Beach Bod, narrated by Dr. Cockroach. The 5 Modesto monsters are hanging out on the beach, with Dr. Cockroach being absolutely stunned by Susan's bikini body, and quite a bit embarrassed about his own pale, twiggy physique, to say nothing of the big bug head that tops it. Susan and Doc discuss future dates, including to Rome and New Zealand, and that's it. Apparently comparing beach bods was the point of the whole chapter. Chapter 17, Personal Investments, narrated by Max. My author's note promises some substance added to the story after a great deal of meaningless partying, so the voice in Max's head kicks in. If I recall correctly, one of the very last scenes of the Maximum Ride books, or what would have been one of the very last scenes, if not for the fact that a 9th book was eventually written, it's revealed that the voice was actually Angel the whole time, which I don't want to complain about that too much, because when you have a long-standing mystery like that over a serialized story that allows for fan theories to be built up, any canonical resolution is going to taste sour, no matter what the resolution is. But I really ought to reread the series at some point with the knowledge that the voice was Angel the whole time. And also read the 9th book. It's something I gotta do to complete my life, Anyway, enough about the actual Maximum Ride books. Let's see what happens in this chapter. They're at the home of Dr. Martinez, who, was it the third book where it was revealed that Dr. Martinez is Max's mother? And yet in the narration, Max calls her Dr. Martinez rather than Mom. I don't remember much of the order of the events as far as the Maximum Ride series goes. Anyway, the voice chastises Max for having left the company of the monsters and Cullens without giving them a second thought, saying that it led Max to Modesto in order to seek protection among them. Iggy gets super jealous over the fact that Nudge is dating someone, and bitter over the fact that Max could date Fang but is avoiding it. That struck me as in character from what I recall about Iggy. I don't know. Chapter 18, Dudes, narrated by Susan. Named for the fact that Link is marathoning a bunch of super testosterone-fueled movies. Beowulf, Tropic Thunder, and 300? Apparently, 10 years ago, that was my idea of stereotypical testosterone-fueled movies. Not that I now know what men watch, but the point of this chapter, a great moment where Dr. Cockroach is revealed to have a massive curved scar or wound across his arms and torso, which he eventually identifies as a very, very large hickey. Chapter 19, Robots, is narrated by Link. Link, Bob, and Insecto are alone, and we get another really great Bob one-liner. You ever feel like you're a motorcycle trapped in a woman's body? Man, whatever else you can say about me as a teenager, I was damn good at random, absurd lines. So the monsters are attacked by Flyboys, the robot mooks from Maximum Ride. Yeah, I remember this. In early Maximum Ride books, the flock were constantly menaced by erasers, which were human-wolf hybrids. I don't know why they were called erasers, but as that first Max story arc went on, eventually the bad guys started producing erasers with wings, and then Flyboys, which were robotic winged erasers covered in biological skin and fur like a Terminator, although I'm not sure what purpose the biological components served. Blending in, maybe? The Maximum Ride series didn't make a lick of sense. Anyway, the three monsters go and fight the Flyboys, Link and Bob doing so on some hovercrafts. Fang contacts Link, having seen the attack on the news, and he doesn't know why the flock's usual enemies would be attacking the Modesto monsters now. Chapter 20, Proposal, narrated by Dr. Cockroach. Dr. Cockroach proposes to Susan with an absolutely massive diamond ring, which he created with his usual impossible science. They return to the Modesto mansion, and Bob calls dibs on Best Man, much to Link's chagrin. Chapter 21, Queso Dip, narrated by Bella. Bella and Edward are invited for a couple's dinner with Susan and Doc. There they cross paths with Susan's parents, who ask how two people so young can have a daughter Renesmee's age, and Bella, in a panic, replies, "I didn't. When I had her, she was just a baby." Okay, I totally stole that joke from The Muppet Show, but it's fucking funny. At the dinner, Susan makes an innocent remark that Bella and Edward are the most loving couple they know aside from themselves, and Susan and Bella quickly engage in a competition as to which one of them has the more passionate relationship. The chapter is entitled Queso Dip because, in a gag stolen from Friends, Bella makes a suggestive remark about her sex life, and Edward's like, they grasp your meaning, I grasp your meaning, the Queso Dip grasps your meaning, thus introducing a running gag which would be most prominent in the second installment of this series, the Queso Dip joke. It's not really a joke so much as it is Queso Dip being mentioned and presumably being inherently funny. It doubtless would barely be noticeable as a running gag if not for the fact that every chapter to contain it is titled after Queso Dip. I know I'm not making it sound very funny, and that's because it's not very funny, but I do it again in a heartbeat. Chapter 22, Blue Moon, is the final chapter of this book, and the first to be narrated by an original character, in this case a fellow by the name of the Big Guy. We get vague descriptions of his many animal-like associates and his plans to nab the flock, and now that the flock have allied with the monsters and these mysterious other entities, he wants to rule all monsters. The Big Guy looks at his own reflection and is greeted by a powder blue gecko. Wow! I think I found a way to make the POV character describes themselves in a mirror trope actually acceptable, when they've been narrating for a while and then what they see in the mirror is genuinely alarming. The Big Guy and his associates, known in this story as the ICBG, would later be rebooted in my next fanfic saga, where they would develop a bit more dimension. And I think they'll be appearing in later volumes of Iris, where they'll get even more dimension. Here in the MVA Twilight Max crossover, however, I'm pretty sure they're just inconsistently written bad guys. And we'll hear more about them next week in the next book of this crossover, entitled ICBG, which, if I recall correctly, stands for International Conglomerate of Bad Guys. That's pretty funny, if not remotely accurate to what the characters turned out to be. Excuse me, need some water. Today in Droon, it's book 26, The Moon Dragon. I dig that, titling the book after a recurring character who's already made several appearances, because presumably, I don't recall correctly, this is the book where it becomes clear that he's the big bad of the entire series, you know. There was a light implication in the previous book that he's plotting to overthrow Emperor Ko, but yeah, I vaguely recall this book. It's another book set primarily in the upper world, those are always epic, but I don't recall much of Gethwing's role in it, so let's see if he deserves being the subject of this installment's title. Chapter 1, Connections. The four kids, accompanied by Max, the King and Queen, and Khan, ascend the rainbow stairs. The 8 of them squeeze out of the cupboard under the stairs and hope that it's still the same day in the upper world as when they left, with Ko having cursed the stairs, they can't be sure. They get some casual clothing for their Droon friends, which made me laugh the first time I read it, because, as you may recall, I had cast Brad Garrett as King Zello and Daniel Radcliffe as Mr. Hinkle, not knowing that I had set up a future event where Brad Garrett has to borrow Daniel Radcliffe's clothes. If you're not laughing yet, Brad Garrett is 16 inches taller than Daniel Radcliffe, so that cracked me up. They head to the pond where the Fifth River ends, and find the town suspiciously empty. Finally, they come upon Spar and Gethwing in the midst of a magical duel, which Eric joins in. Chapter 2, Secrets, Memories, and Cakes. The King and Queen hold off Gethwing while the rest of the party searches for Spar, who apparently disappeared at some point during the fight. I must have missed that. They search the town and confirm that it's completely deserted. They find Spar in the school cafeteria, who confirms that it's been 2 days in the upper world since the gang have been stuck in Droon, and beneath the school is the army of the ancient Knights of Pym, a tribe of impossibly old knights from the upper world, whom Gethwing has taken control of and is forcing to work in Calabaz, while everyone in town has been captured and held there. Gethwing arrives, adding Zello and Relnik to his collection of prisoners. Chapter 3, The Shadowland. Gethwing orders some of the Knights of Pym to take the prisoners to Blackdark Castle, which is acknowledged as being a lame name for an evil fortress, but, I don't know, better than Plud. The other knights are ordered back into the town to find Spar, for a legend says a boy will find it, whatever it may be. Concealing a portion of the veil that separates the upper world from Calabaz, the heroes decide to use Piku's horn to open the other location of the veil that they know of. They do so, and find the caravan entering Blackdark Castle. Chapter 4, A Little Fireside Chat. Julie flies them all to the peak of Blackdark Castle so they can enter through a chimney. Their high vantage point gives them a good look at how Calabaz really is a parallel dimension to Earth, like the Upside Down, but without buildings. They spy on a conversation between Gethwing and the knights, learning that Gethwing is after something called the Pearl Sea. Fed up with his elderly army's elderliness, Gethwing enchants them to be young and powerful again, and decides to question the prisoners one by one. The first prisoner is none other than Eric's mom. Chapter 5, The Wizard's Mom. Mrs. Hinkle proves surprisingly resistant to interrogation from an evil dragon, but knowing she can't hold forever, Spar, accidentally on purpose, reveals himself with the intention of leading Gethwing on a wild goose chase, not actually knowing where the Pearl Sea is. The rest of the gang plan to use the diversion to rescue their parents. Chapter 6, Dungeon of Dungeons. At Spar's behest, Eric takes 2 swords off the wall of the room. In their usual way, they defeat the Pym Knights guarding the dungeon and free the townspeople. As Max and Khan lead the prisoners out of the castle, Meredith lingers behind, and leads Eric and Kia off in another direction to show them that all of the Knights of Pym, a force nearly 1 million strong, are coming from all over Calabaz. The 5 veils that connect Calabaz to the town are apparently the only such veils in all the world, and Gethwing plans to march his army through them. Meredith brings Kia along for some sort of mission, leaving Eric alone and bewildered about how Meredith knows so much. Eric suddenly finds the Calabaz version of the tree in his own front yard, and has a flashback to when he was very young, playing in the tree, when he was given something by someone. He realizes and tells Kia, who seems to have lost track of Meredith, that the Pearl Sea is at his house. Chapter 7, The Pearl Sea. Back in the upper world, the townspeople are banding together, prepared to fight the knights. Eric and Kia race to Eric's house, and Kia puts Eric in a trance to relive the vision so he can properly remember. He enters his parents' bedroom and finds a chest he can't remember ever seeing before, and inside is the Pearl Sea, a tiny white pearl. Just then they hear the voice of Spar, signaling to them that Gethwing and his army have arrived. Chapter 8, Face Off at the School. They exit the house to find that the townspeople are defending the town, armed with sporting goods and janitorial equipment as weapons and armor. Eric and Spar arm themselves with the swords as Gethwing circles overhead. There's an epic battle scene which strains suspension of disbelief. You'd think it'd be a lot bloodier, but this series is still for kids, so it's quite triumphant and awesome. They drive the knights into the empty school building, and there, Eric and Spar face Gethwing on the roof. Chapter 9, Water Girl. Eric's parents rush to his defense, and in the ensuing battle, Eric and Kia end up at the school's swimming pool, where they cross paths with Meredith again. Excuse me a moment, I gotta answer a text. I'm back. Meredith shows them a vision of Spar and Gethwing conspiring together. Spar promising he's on Gethwing's side and that he's gained the hero's trust. When asked how she can do that, Meredith reveals that she is in fact Demether. It's an anagram, you see. After being freed from Spar's control, Demether woke up as a child in the upper world with no memories, but regained her memory after overhearing the kids talking about Droon. She is truly free now, but has no desire to return to Droon right now, still believing herself to have a mission in the upper world. With that, she jumps into the swimming pool and vanishes. Eric confronts Spar, who insists that he really is on the good side now. He begs Eric to trust him, and it's pretty clear why. As soon as Gethwing appears, he starts giving Spar orders, and Spar starts following them. Spar steals the Pearl Sea from Eric, and he and Gethwing call a retreat. Eric is left unsure of which side Spar is deceiving, and all the heroes pursue Spar and Gethwing. Chapter 10, The Moon in Droon. Back in the Shadow Realm, Gethwing is rallying the troops to conquer first the upper world, then Droon. At Spar's telepathic urging, Eric zaps Spar, and Spar very deliberately drops the Pearl Sea into a raging river. Gethwing is enraged and orders an attack, but Neil uses Piku's horn to close all 5 of the veils, and Eric uses the magic sword, which was enchanted by Zara, to turn the Knights of Pym back into harmless old guys. Spar and Gethwing retreat into the pit that leads back to Droon, and Spar sends one last telepathic message to Eric. The Pearl Sea is the last piece of the Moon Medallion. Eric replies that he trusts Spar. He trusts Spar. Blech. Tongue twister. Meredith retrieves the Pearl Sea from the water, Neil reopens the veil, and Relna casts a spell on the townspeople to make them forget everything before Eric can ask his mom where the Pearl Sea came from. They complete the Moon Medallion and get a vision of Galen, back to being his elderly self and in a place swirling with black snow. Relna knows of the one place in Droon where it snows black snow, not anywhere on Droon per se, but rather on its moon. So the heroes return to Droon so they can meet up with Galen on the freaking moon. And there, this book ends. Adaptational notes, 2 new guest stars in this episode, very minor ones. I think the Knights of Pym should have a spokesman, a captain of sorts, and I'd want him to be played by Ed Asner. He'd work well, having a grouchy old man voice that would work for both the original aged version and the dangerous upgrade he gets. And finally, I had originally thought that both Neil's dad and Julie's mom debuted here, but noticed on this read-through that Neil's dad actually has a line way back in Book 9, but this is definitely the first time Julie's mom gets lines, so we'll cast her here. I want to say Jennifer Hale. Also, the voice of the person who gives Eric the Pearl Sea is heard, but I think it would be too spoilery to have an actual credited actor there. Maybe I would do it. Yeah, that character really shouldn't be cast yet, so I'll stand in. Alternatively, maybe this character can be the first appearance of a character credited simply as a mysterious figure, played by Yuri Lowenthal. I'll elaborate on that when I intended to debut this casting choice. Today's Disney film collection viewing begins with Dragonslayer. I don't really know much about this film, just trivia picked up from the Disney Wiki, that being that it was a co-production between Disney and Paramount, and that its non-kid-friendly content led Disney to create Touchstone Pictures. Touchstone, for those of you who don't know, isn't a real production company, just a banner used by Disney when they don't want the Disney name to be associated with a particular film. There are a couple of Touchstone films everyone knows are by Disney, those being Who Framed Roger Rabbit and The Nightmare Before Christmas, but there are loads more. Touchstone films are actually Disney films. So, Michael Bay's Armageddon, Disney film. M. Night Shyamalan's Signs, Disney film. Anyway, let's watch Dragonslayer. I'm excited to see what kind of adult content I might be getting into. I could use some adult content after sitting through over 4 decades of Disney fluff. Not that Disney is all fluff, of course. Well, from the beginning, we're looking at a very 80s fantasy, all dark and grimy. I love that aesthetic. I used to want The Secrets of Droon to have that aesthetic before I changed my mind. The film begins with some band of rabble asking for help from Ulrich, a wizard of some kind. Ulrich's apprentice, played by Peter MacNicol, one of only 2 actors in the film I recognize, persuades him to take his visitors, who wish Ulrich to do battle with a dragon. A lot of place names are dropped early in the film to clue us in that the film takes place in a completely constructed universe. Valerian, the young boy who leads the group of delegates, is clearly a woman in disguise, but that wasn't immediately apparent to me. I had to observe her for quite some time, so it was more convincing than it usually is in the movies. Valerian explains that in her kingdom, virgin girls are sacrificed to a dragon by the name of Vermithrax Pejorative in exchange for the dragon's protection, and by protection I mean non-burnination. Ulrich joins the expedition to slay Vermithrax along with his apprentice, Galen, and their elderly manservant, Hodge. To prove he really is a powerful wizard, Ulrich invites a soldier called Tyrion to stab him. Tyrion obliges, and Ulrich fucking dies. Well, that was unexpected. Galen and Hodge cremate Ulrich and mourn, and Galen inherits all of Ulrich's magical accoutrement. Galen's magic is surprisingly powerful for a young magician in a gritty 80s fantasy. He's more like what you'd expect of a first-level D&D wizard. Yeah. Galen catches up to the despondent expedition and promises to take care of Vermithrax for them. We witness one of the virgin sacrifices, a young woman being ritually chained up to be eaten by the dragon. She tries desperately to escape her chains before Vermithrax gets her. Makes a real heroic effort. I like this girl, very willful and strong. She actually manages to escape her cuffs before, inevitably, Vermithrax catches up and takes his sacrifice. We don't see Vermithrax in full, just a claw here, a tail there, a glimpse of his back, and finally his fire. The special effects aren't impressive. I hope he looks better when seen in all his splendor. Galen comes upon Valerian bathing and discovers that she is a woman. We see both of their naked butts and Valerian's side boob. You don't get that often in a Disney film, but that's not the kind of adult content I had in mind. I can get nudity anywhere. She explains that she's been dressing as a boy her whole life in order to avoid being chosen in the lottery that chooses who gets sacrificed to Vermithrax. Hodge is murdered by Tyrion and passes along Ulrich's ashes to Galen, telling him to throw the ashes in a lake of fiery water, as were the master's wishes. As the group passes by the dragon's lair on the way to the kingdom, Galen decides to see the lair for himself and uses a spell to seal the entrance. The kingdom celebrates the dragon's apparent defeat. Yeah, that's real smart, not going to bite them in the ass at all. Valerian goes out in public dressed as a woman for the first time. The village priest is played by Ian McGiarmid, aka Palpatine, and he seems to be discussing the Christian God, so maybe I was wrong about the world being fictional. Galen is brought before the king, and, ooh, the landscapes in this film are very nice. The king, Cassiodorus Rex, is skeptical, sure that Galen's attack just angered the dragon rather than imprisoning it. So he has Galen thrown in the dungeon. There, he is visited by the king's daughter, Elspeth, and they converse in Greek and Latin, so yeah, I guess it takes place in the real world. I was totally wrong. I just didn't recognize any of the place names. He reveals to her that, contrary to what she's been told, she and the daughters of the wealthy are not in the lottery. Getting confirmation from her father by way of really unconvincing lies, she helps Galen escape, while an escaping Vermithrax causes an earthquake. The priest goes to confront Vermithrax, believing God is on his side, but gets his ass burned to death, giving us the inevitable, slightly better look at Verm, but still not a very clear one. Verm then flies forth and burninates a village. He looks pretty good in flight. The 80s chroma keying is dreadful, but his actual movements are impressive. I wonder how they did that. Some sort of stop motion or puppetry or some such. The king sets up the lottery early in order to appease Vermithrax's rage. Valerian is eligible for it now that she's revealed herself as a woman. Galen turns out to have been hiding with Valerian and her dad, the village blacksmith, who makes Galen a weapon, a spear he names Dragonslayer. But Galen will need his amulet taken from him by the king in order to enchant the weapon to actually be able to harm the dragon. The lottery happens, and the king draws Princess Elspeth's name. As it turns out, she rigged the lotto to make sure only her name was in there. The king is outraged, but Elspeth is determined to face justice for being safe all these years. Meanwhile, Galen is sneaking around the castle trying to steal his amulet back, but the king finds him and just gives him the amulet so he might save the princess. While Galen works on enchanting the spear, Valerian gathers some of Vermithrax's shed scales from his lair and makes a shield. Valerian and Galen confess their feelings for one another. That's a nice touch, the hero falling for his boyish companion rather than the pretty princess. That's, I mean, it's not terribly progressive, but it's pretty good for 1981. There's a tasteful fadeaway that implies, in a Disney sort of way, that they're disqualifying Valerian from the lottery, which, you'll recall, consists of virgins. Bow chicka bow wow. Later that night, Galen goes to save Elspeth from the sacrifice, but Tyrion is there waiting for him. Galen and Tyrion fight, Galen happy to do so to avenge his mentor and sidekick. It's not often that the mentor and sidekick die that early in the story, eh? While they fight, Elspeth walks straight into the dragon's lair, intending to sacrifice herself if no one's going to do it for her. Galen defeats and kills Tyrion, but finds Elspeth has already been killed and eaten by several baby dragons. Horrified and disgusted, Galen slays the wormlings. He then proceeds deeper into the lair, to a lake of fiery water, where we finally see him, Vermithrax Pejorative, regarded by the likes of Guillermo del Toro and George R.R. Martin as the greatest cinematic dragon of all time. He's well worth the wait, a bit puppety, but menacing and massive and truly frightening. Although once my initial awe wore off, I found myself a bit disappointed by his design. He's just not as dragony as I would have liked. I noticed that, like a lot of modern dragons, his forelimbs are a combination of arm and wing. I always thought that was a more recent development in depictions of dragons, but here's one from 1981. I much prefer the other way, where a dragon has arms, legs, and wings. Dragons are so much more than just big winged reptiles, and being six-limbed vertebrates just helps add to that impression. As Galen begins to lure Vermithrax out of the lair, the dragon mourns its slain young, because of course it does. That's a really nice touch, showing our monstrous antagonist having a moment of grief, which quickly becomes vengeful fury. Galen and Vermithrax fight each other for a while, and it ultimately ends in a draw, the dragon-slaying spear getting stuck in Verm's throat, while Galen is left to die, only to be found later by Valerian. After recovering at Valerian's house, Galen and Valerian decide to flee the kingdom and go live somewhere else. They come to realize that if magic really is dying from the world, then perhaps the last dragon will soon die as well, and no longer be anyone's problem. As they depart, however, Galen suddenly remembers that Vermithrax's lair was a lake of fiery water, exactly the sort of place Ulrich wanted his ashes spread. He and Valerian rush back to the dragon's lair, Galen figuring out that Ulrich had a plan. You know, I noticed Dragonslayer and Dragon's Lair sound very similar. Those are two very common dragon terms, and that kind of, you could mistake one for the other. Anyway. Galen figures Ulrich had a plan, and sure enough, the fiery lake resurrects Ulrich, who reveals that getting killed at the beginning of the journey was his plan all along, as he was too old to make the journey from his home to the kingdom. Now that he's alive again, it's time for he and Galen to face Vermithrax. Ulrich says, "I want you to destroy the amulet, and me along with it," and pulls a "you will know when the time is right." There's a solar eclipse and a meteor shower, and Ulrich calls forth a storm, which stops as suddenly as it began, and Vermithrax swoops in to face them. Verm doesn't talk, incidentally, if you were wondering, and that's not right. Dragons should talk. They're way better antagonists that way. Ulrich and Vermithrax do battle, while Galen looks on, ready for the right moment to smash the amulet. When Vermithrax grabs Ulrich in his claws and begins to fly away, Galen thinks that's the right moment, and shatters it with a big rock, causing Ulrich to explode, the explosion killing Vermithrax instantly and sending his body plummeting into a mountain lake. Verm's half-exploded body is later recovered and looks incredibly gory and gruesome. The village celebrates the dragon's defeat, that they give more credit to God than to Galen. The king, in turn, stabs the dragon's corpse, taking the credit completely from Galen. With magic and dragons completely gone from the world now, Galen and Valerian decide to spend the rest of their lives walking the earth. When Galen wishes aloud that they had a horse, a perfect white steed comes over the horizon, and they ride it into the sunset as the credits roll. One interesting credit, Dragon Supervisor Phil Tippett. Damn it, Phil, you had one job. Yes, the same Phil Tippett who got Dinosaur Supervisor credit in Jurassic Park. Does he not get the best job titles? And we end, as we began, with a very old-school Paramount logo. I don't think the Disney logo existed yet. I certainly haven't seen it yet. So, a pretty good 80s fantasy movie. Like all 80s fantasy movies, makes me want to make my own. Not a lot of Keys and Kingdoms lore, since it basically works on Dungeons and Dragons rules, save for the fact that wizards are called sorcerers in it, and the wizard needs to wear an amulet in order for his magic to work. Maybe the sacrifice by lottery part? I've heard of that being used on various other creatures in the D&D world, although I'm not sure why only virgin women were sacrificed to Vermithrax, now that I think about it. It's not like he was some sort of demon who needed virgin's blood for his magic, he just ate them. All the same, virgin blood being a magical component, I've got to remember that components are a part of Keys and Kingdoms magic. Note to self, write that into the choices. Alter every spell that gets cast if I must. Components are a major part of magic. Material components, that is. And how about the bit where being cremated and thrown into a lake of fiery water resurrects Ulrich? There ought to be a way to make contingency plans of that sort. Also, the fact that there's a solar eclipse going on during the climax, that doesn't really play a role, it's just going on. And that's a neat element. And that perfect white horse reminds me of what sort of magical horses should exist in the K&K world. There's plenty of kinds to talk about. Next, we watched The Fox and the Hound. I know I've seen this one, but I was real little, so I don't really remember anything about it. I think maybe there's a scary bear at some point. I hear tell it's quite a massive tearjerker. Mickey Rooney and Kurt Russell play our protagonists. That's a pretty big star power for an 80s cartoon. Both John Musker and Ron Clements worked on this one. They're kind of hidden in the credits. They'll be the duo I mentioned in a previous week. They'd end up directing some classics together. This one happens to be directed by two guys I've never heard of, and Richard Rich. So he did manage to become a director at Disney before breaking off from them. Cool. I mean, he's a hack, but cool. The film opens with a mother fox fleeing from some barky dogs with her baby kit in her mouth. Eventually, she leaves the kit hidden someplace before running off and getting shot for her trouble. An owl by the name of Big Mama, voiced by Pearl Bailey, swoops down to comfort the poor teeny baby fox, and enlists some of her fellow birds, a little sparrow called Dinky, played by Dick Bacallion, and a big old woodpecker named Boomer, played by Paul Winchell, to help find the kid a place to live and be cared for. I've never seen or heard of any of these characters in my life. It's really surreal to realize there are Disney animated characters I've never seen, or at least I don't recall seeing. So Boomer knocks on the door of one Widow Tweed, played by Jeanette Nolan, who answers the door to find Big Mama and Dinky messing with her laundry. Okay, this part I may actually remember. It unlocks some trigger in my memory. The birds steal her laundry and drape it over the fox kit so the widow finds him. The widow wraps up the fox in her apron, feeds him, and names him Todd. Meanwhile, Tweed's neighbor, Slade, played by Jack Albertson, comes home with a baby hound dog and introduces it to his current dog, Chief. I recognize Albertson. He played Grandpa Joe in Willy Wonka. Nice. A cut to some time later when Todd and Copper are not quite so tiny as they used to be, but still pretty tiny. Todd causes some interference with Tweed's farm work, but she can't bring herself to be angry with him. He's family. Young Todd, voiced by Keith Coogan, is still on good terms with Dinky and Boomer, who are still doing what they were doing when we first came upon them, hunting down Squeaks the caterpillar with the intent to eat him. He really ought to be a butterfly by now, hadn't he? Don't caterpillars only stay caterpillars for like a couple of weeks or so? That's not how caterpillars work. Speaking of butterflies, Todd pursues one across the fence to Slade's property, where we come upon Chief and the new puppy, Copper, voiced respectively by Pat Buttram and Corey Feldman. Copper smells something unfamiliar and goes searching for it, and there Copper and Todd meet. As kids do, they immediately start playing together and become fast friends. A musical montage sequence shows us that they continue to play together in future days, but eventually Slade starts tying up Copper so he doesn't wander off. Chief and Slade discover Todd and try to catch him, causing all sorts of havoc around the two farms, concluding with Slade going after Todd with a shotgun. Tweed and Slade get in a big argument, Slade calling her woman or female near every sentence, and swearing that he won't allow Tweed's fox on his property again. So Tweed makes Todd an inside fox. Slade takes Chief and Copper off on a long hunting trip. They let Feldman do Copper's barking. That's adorable. And so Todd watches Copper leave, not even getting a chance to say goodbye, not to see each other again until next spring. Big Mama sings a little song about how Copper is going to be a hunting dog when he comes back, so Todd had better beware. His friend will soon be his enemy. Todd refuses to believe it. Autumn arrives, then winter. Squeaks is still a frickin' caterpillar, and there's another comical chase scene in the snow before the bird boys go south for the winter. When they return, Todd is a full-grown fox, played by Mickey Rooney, and Squeaks is still a frickin' caterpillar. And Dinky and Boomer are still determined to kill and eat him, despite apparently knowing his name. That's just brutal. Slade returns from his hunting trip with a full-grown Copper, played by Kurt Russell, and lots of hunting trophies. Big Mama tries again to warn Todd, but Todd is sure Copper will be glad to see him. That night, Todd approaches, but now Copper, too, thinks that since he's a hunting dog now, they shouldn't be friends. Chief wakes up and they chase Todd into the woods. Copper tracks Todd down, but decides not to give up his location to Slade, but warns him this is the only time he'll let him go. Chief chases Todd across some railroad tracks and gets his ass run over by the train. Since it's a Disney film, getting run over by a train leaves Chief completely unmarked, and in fact he's still alive when Copper finds him, but unusually doesn't get any dramatic last words before dying. Copper is furious at Todd and swears revenge. I was not expecting Copper to have this kind of attitude, and we're not even an hour into the movie yet. Is Copper the film's antagonist? Later, Slade goes to Tweed's house and demands that she surrender Todd to him. Though she refuses, he said he'll get the fox eventually, so in an incredibly poignant and heartbreaking scene, Tweed decides to drive Todd out into the forest and release him into the wild. I guess this is the tearjerker everyone's talking about. Yeah, it kind of got me choked up a little. So Todd has to navigate the forest by himself in the rain. A porcupine, played by John Fiedler, offers him shelter. Oh, Jesus, Chief isn't dead, he just has a broken leg. Boo, give your story real stakes, Disney. Slade is pissed that Tweed managed to get rid of Todd, like behind his back, but prepares to plant snares in the forest. That's one of the parts of the film I remember from him when I was little, Slade demonstrating his nasty traps. The next morning, Big Mama flies out into the forest looking for Todd, instead running into another fox she's acquainted with, Vixie, played by Sandy Duncan, and immediately begins shipping the two. So you know a male fox and a female fox, and you automatically assume you can set them up? It's kind of racist and heteronormative. But Big Mama and Vixie find Todd all forlorn, but Todd is immediately cheered up by the sight of Vixie. They begin to flirt, watched over by Todd's 3 bird friends. Todd tries to impress her by catching some fish, but of course he has no idea how to do so, so he makes a complete ass of himself, but Vixie is charmed regardless, despite Todd initially being angry at her for laughing at him and borrowing a few of Slade's misogynistic slurs. Yikes. But Big Mama sings a love song, and the two foxes reconcile and really hit it off. But the film isn't about foxes and love, it's about the relationship of a fox and a hound, and by this point, I was holding my breath, nervous about what was coming next. Slade goes into the forest, ignoring the no hunting signs there, and has Copper track Todd down, and they lay some traps around. Todd and Vixie emerge from her burrow after, I assume, a nice night of fox banging, and wander through the quiet forest where they deal with Slade's traps and guns and Copper. Vixie runs for the burrow while Copper and Todd square off, both looking absolutely terrifying as they growl and bite at each other. But soon the hunter and hound have the foxes cornered in their burrow, which is on fire. The foxes take the chances of running through the flames and escape. As Slade and Copper pursue, they run into a scary bear. Not as scary or dramatically lit as I remember. Maybe I was thinking of the bear from Balto? And Slade gets caught in one of his own snares. Copper fights the bear, and Todd decides to go help him. Todd draws the bear away from Slade and Copper, and gets his butt kicked for his trouble. Both bear and fox end up falling into a raging river. Todd washes up on shore, and Copper finds him, and stands in front of him so Slade won't shoot. Thank God. Copper defends his friend, and Slade, surprisingly enough, is understanding, so he brings Copper home. The film ends with Boomer and Dinky still pursuing Squeaks, who only now becomes a butterfly. It usually doesn't take a full year. Tweed tends to Slade's injured foot while Copper and Chief look on, and Todd watches from a distance within the forest. Todd and Copper recall the promise they made as little pups that they would always be friends, and they go on with their lives. So that was beautiful. Not only was Copper not the villain, neither was Slade, ultimately. He stopped wanting to kill the fox when his dog expressed loyalty to his quarry. That's real nice. So, what can I learn about keys and kingdoms from this film? Well, there's the fact that our antagonist wields a shotgun and sets nasty hunting snares. And it's definitely time to invoke a fantasy aspect to this world that I've long wanted to employ. That being, every kind of animal can be tamed, can be trained, can have loyalties, can understand the basics of human languages even if it can't speak them. I think I may have said all that already, but it's something I've always wanted to invoke in a fantasy setting of my creation. So, that was a tough podcast to get through for some reason, but look at that, nearly 40 minutes long. It's been a while since I've had one of that length. I've been feeling a bit burned out lately, with the work and this. Certainly didn't get this one done a week early like I planned to, but, let's hope I can do that with the next one. I'll see you then.